Welcome back to Facilities in Focus. Thank you so much for listening and joining me on your journey throughout the internet today. In case you forgot, my name is Mackenna Moralez, and I am the Associate Editor of FacilitiesNet and your host. Today is a very special day because I am joined by two, yes, count them, two, yes. I have Mike Flynn with me, and Mike is an associate principal and leader in Lawrence Group's education practice. He is passionate about creating design solutions that are seamlessly integrated within their surrounding environments, respecting the history and culture of their communities at large. From technically complicated utility projects to large scale historic rehabilitation endeavors, his versatility and expertise has made him an essential partner in some of the company's most impactful projects. But also joining us today is Javier Esteban. Javier is a principal at Lawrence Group and a leader of the firm's higher education and student housing practice. Javier brings a holistic approach to every design challenge, considering the effect of each design on the higher education experiences. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys. How are you?
Great.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Oh, good. So, as our listeners can probably tell by your introductions, we are talking about design today. And more important, we're talking about retrofitting to make education facilities more accessible to everyone on the campus or within the building. And this is actually something that I've been thinking a lot about as people have been discussing what accessibility means to them lately. And I just remember when I was in college, I was really lonely. I went to school far away from everyone, but I tried really hard to convince one of my friends to transfer to my school, but she wouldn't do it because it wasn't accessible for her particular disability. And I was just wondering, Mike, if you can answer, what are the first steps you take when evaluating an older education facility for accessibility improvements?
Well, I guess, these questions typically come to us in two different ways. Sometimes it's a university trying to be very conscious about their accessibility upgrades and they may have had a request for accommodation on a building or a part of a building. So sometimes we'll start with that, or sometimes it's just that they're starting a major renovation project, and we when we're approaching sort of the accessibility of an existing building, we like to kind of start from the outside, so start from the arrival point. Where are the people getting to this building? Is it a parking lot? Is it a bus stop? Is it pedestrian pathway? And then I like to kind of work my way in from there. And it's a way to check that you're hitting all the boxes. If you kind of just picture yourself walking through the site and the building and make sure that you're sort of hitting all of the key points of access.
Mhm. What are some of the most common changes
So
you've had to make?
So, I think when ADA started, ADA came about in the early 90s, and I feel like a lot of campuses may have made a big push early on, and some of them have upgraded elevators and things like that. But the main focus for us is sort of the eager or the path of travel. So we want to focus on entrances, signage, emergency egress, and restrooms, the sort of the main functions of the building. So we'll typically work through all those items and see where might need to make upgrades. If a door is not wide enough or doesn't have the proper approach to it, we'll sort of start to note where we need to make improvements to accommodate the accessibility requirements.
Javi, is there anything you would like to add to that? Anything in particular you'd like to evaluate?
Yes, it is very interesting because, well, as Mike mentioned, ADA started in 1990, but before that, it was ANSI, and that was a response from the military, injured military that came from the Vietnam War, and they were responding to injuries basically within the legs. So they were focusing on upper strength, and so you had the grab bars and things like that, responding to that. That they were able to pull themselves with the arms. This has been evolved. It's been an evolution where now, so we're talking about other abilities or other situations, and then it has been evolved the requirements. And after that, then we have also audiovisual issues. We have also mental wellness as part of it. And so we are looking, and then we have the universal design approach to that. One thing is a couple of things that I really like to do when I do focus groups with the students is if I can get hold of a wheelchair, and it's just the perception of the spaces from a wheelchair standpoint is completely different.
Mhm.
A regular table that has a 90-degree angle suddenly become a really threatened point, and so maybe around edges and on those it may be an issue. Or I use the sock. I put a sock on my hand, and if you are able to, without the ability of using your fingers, open a door, open a window, things like that, those are very important aspects because you don't know what the ability of the student is going to be, and you need to be prepared to any other all these other issues. And this is just beyond what the code said. Right now, for example, there is the new ANSI 2017, which is acknowledging the use of electric chairs, which gives you the requirement to have larger spaces, which is because these chairs, well, not only needed to be charged, so you need a special outlets for that, but also they are bigger. They require a wider turn radius to move around. So you have to be mindful of all those things.
Yeah, and I,
Mhm.
I would add, Javi, you mentioned the 117.1, the new 2017 version, and that's something that, it hasn't been adopted by everybody. It's I think 2021 IBC is what really started to kick in the requirements of the ICC 117.1 2017, and so a lot of those requirements haven't hit most jurisdictions. A lot of people are still under older accessibility codes. So, I think one thing that uh, sort of informally amongst the Lawrence group, we've started to
Hmm.
try to adopt the ANSI 117.1 2017 as sort of a standard. So we try to do that as a minimum company wide, even if the municipality has not adopted that code because it's sort of a best practices for modern day living, and it's not always achievable, especially with existing buildings. You run into challenges with some of that stuff. So where we can, we usually try to design to the highest degree of accessibility.
Right. That actually leads into my next question really well. Like, what are some common accessibility challenges you encounter when retrofitting education facilities?
Well, I don't know what happened. I love the architecture of the 70s, but I don't know what happened with the architects in the 70s, that they all wanted to have a stair and split spaces. So you always encounter a lot of stairs and multiple spaces, which are wonderful. I mean, beautiful spaces, but then how do you access to that? So we find that we have to start adding elevators. They go multiple, they don't go from floor to floor, but they go half floor to half floors in order to be able to reach those spaces that had been designed at mid heights. So that is the first one. It's like the approach to that. The other one obviously is the bathroom. That is a major issue, and together with that, when we do renovations, you have a lower floor to floor, which forces you to have mechanical systems in special areas, and how those take away spaces that will otherwise be useful for students in they have other special needs. In terms of, for example, one of the very interesting things to me is if you are in a residence hall, you have a double bedroom that is accessible. Well, the ADA requires that you have two beds. You have one bed on each wall. So you have a center point, which it has to be a minimum of 3 foot wide. It could be usually it's more than that. But if you are in a single room, the bed needs to be located in the center. It doesn't have to go to one side or the other of the wall, but rather in the center. And that way you can approach it from each side, which is kind of to me, has always been a very strange situation, because eventually the student will put it on one side or the other of the wall, depending if they want to get from the right or to the left, and eventually it will get more space. But the principle is just to put it in the center, and that makes the space wider than usually the spacing of the column grid is, and that is one of the challenges that we find very often.
Well, I think adding on to that discussion about restrooms, Javi, I think that's probably the number one issue that I see when I'm retrofitting buildings is the old restroom, the multi-stall restrooms were just not built big enough to accommodate, the new needs of modern accessibility. And, sometimes everybody always throws around the term technically infeasible. It's like, well, you don't have to upgrade it if it's technically infeasible. And restrooms are probably the only place where I sometimes fall into that discussion, because the renovation may not be that large, but you need to add an accessible restroom, and to modify an existing bank of multi-stall restrooms. You get into plumbing walls and you start blowing out these walls, and the spaces start growing, and things just really escalate quickly in terms of costs. So one of the things that we do a lot is that we'll just leave the existing restroom, and we'll find another location within the building for a sort of single stall restroom that's accessible and can be a family restroom or a gender neutral restroom. So it kind of serves multiple purposes by creating that extra restroom.
I completely agree, because it's a catch-22. If you're trying to renovate an existing group of a bathroom with multi-stalled, then you are taking space, take away fixtures, but you still need to comply with the other side of the code that tells you, well, you need this minimum amount of plumbing fixtures. So then you have to grab spaces in other areas in order to accommodate both things, the accessibility and the number of plumbing fixtures required for that usage.
When I was in college, I guess this is going to be the podcast of me beefing with my university. My freshman year, I lived in an all-girls dorm, which is already kind of gross because college-age girls. But I lived on the fourth floor, no elevator, and the stalls were very tiny. How do you plan for accessibility in an older building that doesn't have an elevator like that?
Well, we that is one thing that the 1990 ADA was addressing accessibility. Then 2010 ADA addressed specifically ADA for places of education, and that was specifically talking about residence halls and the concept of visitability. The fact that you are in the second floor, you want to see your classmates or friends that are in the fifth floor. So then the elevator hit everybody in renovations. And what we find is not only that you need one elevator, which the rule of thumb for residence halls is one elevator for every 250 students. So
Mhm.
if the size is appropriate, say just one elevator will be fine. But what happens if you are in that elevator, you go to the upper floor, and then that elevator is in service? Then you're stuck in that floor for how many days is going to be fixed. So we end up doing two elevators.
Right.
That way, one may not be functioning, but the other one is. And I'm not talking about just a person that is always in, let's say, in a wheelchair or always has problems. We're talking about maybe he's an athlete student that broke a leg, and
Mhm.
he has to be here for 2 months in that condition. Some universities decided to move them to another building or to another room that allows that, but that's not the ideal situation. It's a lot of moving all the things, and of course the students don't pack anything. They are small boxes and they're really clean and they're really, it's very easy to move things. I'm kidding, obviously. Yeah.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Javi said. I mean, I think, um, you know, typically we try to plan for additional elevators. A lot of the buildings that I've worked on, academic buildings, have not jumped to two elevators. Like I said, a lot of buildings that were upgraded, in the 90s, they were just trying to meet minimum code. So a lot of
Mhm.
them have made the jump and have a single elevator to meet the code. But beyond that, I haven't seen a whole lot in sort of traditional academic historic buildings or just existing buildings of people moving to a second elevator like that. But I agree with everything Javi said, like having that sort of backup elevator in case one goes down is critical. Or, having a other means of egress or points for people to sort of self-rescue or sit in an area in the stairwell for evacuation at a later date or a later time is another approach to making sure people are safe in historic buildings.
Hmm.
And one thing, just Mike brings the point of view of the academic building. I bring the point of view of the residence hall, and the usage are very different. And when you go to an academic building, you go there, you stay for a few hours for the classes, and then you leave to another building. In a
Right.
residence hall, you go, and that is where you spend most of the time, and you're sleeping there. You're spending half of your day basically there, doing whatever. May probably sleeping very little, but you stay there. You're studying. You're with a friend. So the approach to those two different academic buildings, I mean, this college type of buildings is a little bit different. Yes.
Yes. I think all the buildings at my university were old.
Yeah.
And I was always huffing and puffing up 3 flights of stairs to get to classes because if they did have elevators, I was too afraid to use them. They always seemed old and not the most sturdy at all. But Mike, you mentioned how in the 90s when ADA was first introduced, people were just trying to meet the minimum of the codes. Do you still feel like people are doing that?
Um, so most of our clients are pretty receptive to what we tell them. They look to us to interpret the code and the accessibility guidelines. So I think, a lot of times it does fall on the architect to sort of push clients to adopt different accessibility things and understand how some of those accessibility requirements work. Um, we talk about this pretty often in my group about, the accessibility code that was started in the 90s, that was 40 years ago now. And there's still buildings that are not completely upgraded and are still, have not met minimum codes for accessibility. And it feels like at some point there's going to be a push to say like, look, you've had 40 years, 45 years to upgrade your your buildings to meet these codes? Like at some point, did they say like, look, you've got to get an elevator in this building, or there's certainly there's provisions when you change use of a building or do a certain level of renovation that you have to make those kinds of upgrades. But I think to your original question, a lot of times the facilities directors look to us to make the recommendations and to help them prioritize. It's really, a lot of times in a renovation, if you're not gutting the whole building, there's sort of different levels of renovation that you take on. What should you prioritize in terms of the accessibility? And typically those things are the main path of travel and major components like restrooms and doors and things like that, things that would be major barriers. So, we do get a lot of questions about accessibility and uh, and that's typically the approach that we take is kind of help them prioritize what they can get done for their budget because everybody has big hopes for their budget and wants to stretch the budget as far as they can. Um, but there's certain accessibility things that are always required when you do a renovation to a building that is in dire need of accessibility upgrades.
Mm. Do you ever get any pushback from people? Or are you just like, come on, guys, you've had time?
Generally, I really haven't. I mean, most people most facilities folks understand the need to upgrade facilities, and many of these universities have had requests for accommodation or even uh, OCR complaints where they've got somebody from the state office of civil rights that will come and say like, look, we've got a major complaint on something. We need you guys to fix
Mm.
this, and they'll have somebody come out and do an evaluation on the particular issue. I've been on a couple of those walkthroughs with different universities, and typically those folks are just focusing on the one issue that was uh, a part of the complaint, and um, but they will tell you like they see all the other issues with accessibility, but at the time they're only focusing on the issue that was part of the complaint. So, um, you
Mm.
know, it's it's something that they don't want to. Universities need to protect themselves. They don't want to bring on any lawsuits for lack of accessibility. So they take it very seriously. And when we tell them that there's something in the code requiring this space or this change or this accessibility requirement, they generally are very receptive and open to those recommendations.
Right. Because when you're able-bodied, you don't think about those types of things. And accessibility means something different to nearly everyone. We talked about if you have a wheelchair or even if you're just have a broken ankle and just need a little extra time. But I've noticed lately how important the push buttons are on doors because I have a baby. So just pushing the strollers is so hard to get through doors now. And
Hmm.
just being able to have an automatic door, I'm way more grateful than I had ever been in the
And
past.
that's one of those things that prior to the 2021 building code, I think, the automatic operators were not technically required by code and accessible ADA and ANSI and the ICC. None of them required auto operators. I
That's
think
crazy.
I know, and we always push for them at major entrances. And even to this day, like so 2021 has adopted, like I said, the ICC 2017, the A117. Um, so in there are requirements in the 2020 building code where they do now require buildings of certain types. So like business and mercantile and assembly, they'll have certain requirements that will then require an auto operator, and it's a pretty high threshold. I think it's like 500 people or 300 people for
Mhm.
for different occupant types. So it takes a pretty good sized building to even require auto operators by code. And that was one of those things that I learned on one of those OCR walks with one of the folks from the state of Missouri was that the exterior doors are exempt from the requirements, like the push requirements, the push pull requirements. Typically, you're allowed 5 pounds of force for a
Mhm.
door with a closure on it, and they recognized that the exterior doors were never going to meet that requirement because of the pressure differential between the interior and the exterior of a space. So it was always something that, it always seemed like such an odd thing to me that they wouldn't require auto operators because those are always the hardest doors to open because of that pressure differential.
Right.
And they weren't required by code. So we always push for them, and most universities have have agreed that they're very useful, and they help everybody.
Mhm.
Like you said, it's not just for people in wheelchairs. It's helpful for mothers with children. It's helpful for people carrying large amounts of stuff or with carts, and I think it's really important to have those at any sort of major entry into an academic building.
Right, like, God forbid something ever happens to you and you find out that your home, because when you're at school, when you're at a college, that's your home for the time being,
Mhm.
especially if you go far away, and God forbid something happens to you and then you find out that your home isn't accessible to you. I think that's kind of a nightmare situation. Javi, you look like you've had something to say, and I feel like I keep on talking over you.
Oh, oh no, no, it's fine, it's fine. Yeah, and we have seen an evolution. We talk about the push button. Now there are some bars that you can put next to the door that you don't even have to have your hands and access for. For example, somebody that is paraplegic, they has no access, they no mobility on their hands. So there are some vertical bars that are next to the door that you can just touch a little bit with a wheelchair and they will access to it. Or there are proximity cars, they you just get close to it and the access. So it has been evolving because of all these different abilities that happen. Now, one thing that is very important to differentiate between the code and then the accessibility thing is accessibility guidelines and requirements are a federal requirement, and it is a civil rights issue. So
Mhm.
anybody at any point can go and have a complaint. While you are doing a building code issue, that will be the inspector, the one that does it. So you're basically, you are a student, you can bring a complaint for non-accessible situation, and then it goes straight to the federal government or to the state through the federal government response to determine that. And so you have a penalty, which is individual penalties per every single issue that is not compliant, plus the requirement of fixing it. So it's a double whammy. So that's when Mike was referring to lawsuits, that is very critical. Yes.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that you mentioned was just accessibility on campuses in general, and I don't know, obviously, a lot of campuses love these hilly sites, and there's so many campuses that are just built into the hillside, and they're beautiful, and they've got rolling hills everywhere, and it makes it a challenge for accessibility on campus overall. You can't build accessible ramps to every building on campus. There would be ramps everywhere. So, one of the things that a lot of universities do to get around that is they'll have a shuttle service that can pick you up and take you to each entry, and that's typically the point where you sort of pick up the accessibility requirements is on those you know from that drop off point to the building. There's other accessible routes that you certainly try to maintain wherever the natural landscape allows. You make sure that you have the proper curb cuts, and minimize any slopes where possible. Sometimes there's a 10% slope on a hill, and you're just never going to overcome that. So there's
Hmm.
certain things that they have to do on campuses to try and meet the intent of the code because they couldn't possibly build enough ramps to accommodate the true accessible requirements.
Oh,
Right.
I completely agree. They call it like point-to-point uh, uh, transportation, and there are some. And when you're talking about residence halls, for example, there are some times that, well, especially on historical campuses, where they have like a little compromise where they say, okay, we can access to these buildings, and those are the ones that we are making accessible, and we are going to add more units than what is required for that building because we had to make up for those that are in a different place on top of the hill that there is no way you can make it happen. Especially in the
Hmm.
northern climes with a ramp with ice is not a good idea. So
Right. I So, as you guys know, I'm based in Wisconsin, and we get those bad winters here. They live up to all the stereotypes. But when I was in school, there is a residence hall that was so far away from campus that everybody took the shuttle that lived there to get to campus. But during the winter, because it was at the bottom of a hill, a very steep hill, it would completely ice over. And that hill was owned by the city, so they wouldn't salt it in time. So every year there would be this huge video compilation of people just falling down
Yeah,
down the hill with ice. And it was funny. It was funny, but it always looks so painful.
yeah,
I
yeah,
never
and,
and,
lived
and
there.
and the imagination of students with ice and snow and hills is limitless.
yeah.
You know,
Well, and,
they,
and
they can
I
do
was
a
going to
lot of
add,
things.
Javi. I was going to add, like to your point about, you know, locating additional accessible units in a building that is more accessible. You know, if there is a one of the dorms that's on top of the hill and you just never want to access that, like one of the things that I've found is that, while campuses may provide a shuttle system, these students are just like any other students, and they want their independence and they want to be able to
Hmm.
move about campus without having to rely on a shuttle system. So,
Right.
I think the adjustments that Javi was referencing, where you put more accessible units in a building that has better site and campus accessibility is a great approach to allowing people more independence and not having to count on a shuttle system because they want that freedom just like any other student.
That is where mechanized wheelchairs have been more and more successful because they can go over those steeper hills with easier in an easier way without the physical strength that is required with when you have a traditional wheelchair.
Hmm. In what ways do you involve students or disability advocates in the design process? Javi, it seems like you're very passionate about this.
Yeah, we during our design process, we embed that it's part of the design process basically. And when we are, whether it's a renovation or it's a new construction, we always like to have a lot of input from the users, for the stakeholders. So basically, we like to have focus groups that no more than 15 people, because we found that 15 is the right number. When you have loud voices, people have a tendency to hear those loud voices. But the
Hmm.
reality is 90% of the students, they don't have those loud voices. No, they are the majority silent, and we need to pay very close attention to them as well. And it's when they bring not only just the fact that somebody is has these issues, but some sports students or even regular student that goes and breaks a leg. So then we talk about windows, for example, and how you access to the window. What type of window will be have the right way of locking it and out, and what Mike was talking about, the 5 pound force that window manufacturers have to that are struggling with that, and And when I was talking about the round edges of the doors, sorry, on the tables, that is something that came from one student saying, I'm in this wheelchair just a test, and wow, this corner really is menacing to me. It's like, okay, well, what about if we start using round edges and things like that? So that comes from then as the dialogue, as it comes in, no different than we're talking about right now, in a very informal way, and suddenly they start coming up with ideas. Or, for example, well, we want to have on the lounges a little bit of carpet, more carpet, and then on the sidewalk, on the path, on the corridors, a little harder surface. It's because somebody that cannot hear very well, but they recognize the sound difference between repose, or some places to rest and some places to walk, or the texture of the walls also as well. And somebody can just with their hand see that there's something is going on that's going to happen. So all those things, they come from not only the universal design point of view and guidelines, but also from their own students when they go and they talk about their own experience or the experiences of their friends. One of the things that, for example, that we learned doing residence halls, where there were a larger amount of students that have a lot of hear loss. Well, the corridors end up being wider, and the reason is because when they are communicating, they had to see each other. So they are not walking in parallel, but they are rather looking at each other and doing sign language. So it requires a little more space. So
Right.
all those things are things that with experience and with the incredible knowledge and experience that the students have, help us to create those spaces.
Mhm. I know, Mike, you said that you don't work with students all that often, but when you are looking at the academic buildings, do you ever think about when you were a student and what you would have wanted?
Yeah, and I guess when I say I haven't worked with student groups, that's kind of specific to like accessibility concerns. Like typically I'll have student groups that I work with through programming, and the accessibility part is usually for me, it's typically a discussion with the facilities folks, and they've had enough experience with challenges on campus and
Mhm.
people with disabilities that we sort of have those conversations separately. And I think one of the things, I'm thinking of an example that we just had. We're working on a design of a new front entry library plaza at a university, and currently, it's not very equitable. It's a very formal staircase, and then there's sort of an ADA ramp off to the side, and then it kind of you jog to the other side to get to the next ramp. And I think one of the things that our design on that project is trying to do is create a sort of equitable entry that is used by all. So the grade change from the sidewalk to the main entry is about 6 feet, and we've determined that we can sort of create this meandering pathway, this landscape pathway, um, with fountains and plantings and seating, all integrated into the accessible route, but it is also the main route for everybody. So trying to create those sorts of opportunities where you aren't isolating the accessible route from the general public route is something that we try to do whenever we can, is just make that main entry, that main opportunity and moment of the design accessible for everybody.
Mhm. I know that we are running a little short on time, but I just wanted to ask, obviously retrofitting for accessibility is not a quick process, but is there any quick wins that our facility listeners can implement to make the process a little bit easier?
Yeah, in
Uh,
renovation, there is nothing easy.
there are, I mean, I think of a couple things. The first thing that I've seen before is, it was actually on a residence hall at a university, and they still had uh, round doorknobs on all the
Yeah.
entries to the doors.
Right.
And that's a pretty quick, simple, doesn't take a lot of design time or effort, and contractor can get in there and swap all those out for like a lever style entry pretty quickly. So things like that are always beneficial and relatively low cost. I mean, obviously it adds up when you multiply a lever set by 200 doors or whatever it may be, but um, improving those sorts of things is always something that is a quick win.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. Sometimes thresholds they are more than half an inch, and you can just feather up or work. Those are easy to do. One of the most difficult things for me is the requirement from the code that 60% of the exits need to be accessible, and sometimes it's impossible when you're talking about an older building because that you can do a lot of work on the main entrance and maybe a second entrance, but let's say that you have 4 entrances and then 60% is basically 3 of them. So you need to study that very carefully, and sometimes is very challenging.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak with me. Is there anything else you would like to add before I let you go?
Other than just have the mind of embed in the design process the accessibility. It cannot be an afterthought. It has to be part of the process.
I think
Yeah,
that's a good one.
I couldn't agree
Right.
more.
That's a good way to end. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you, Mackenna.
Thank you for listening to the Facilities in Focus podcast. Facilities in Focus is a product of the facility market, which houses FacilitiesNet, building operating management, facilities maintenance decisions, and healthcare facilities today. Thank you to our sound and video editor, Paul Ellertson. Thank you to Morgan Johnson for designing our logo. Thank you to Dan Melton, Dave Lubach, Dan Hounsell, Jeff Warden, Jill McDermott, and everyone else at Trade Press Media Group. For comments, or if you are interested in being a guest on Facilities in Focus, please email us at fnpodcast@tradepress.com.